What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely. Today, I've received a fixed penalty notice from the Metropolitan Police relating to an event in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020.
Boris Johnson is in the ignominious position of being the first Prime Minister in office found to have broken the law. Tonight, he vows to get on with the job. But is position in number 10 untenable? One rule for the Queen alone at her husband's funeral and millions upon millions of others. Another for the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and Boris Johnson's wife. All fined for attending a birthday party in Downing Street during lockdown. All guilty of law breaking. It's an extraordinary moment and this could just be the start. But for now at least, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are staying put. Tonight, we devote the programme to questions of probity, responsibility and conduct in the great offices of state. We'll hear from politicians who believe the country's two most senior political figures should stay and others who want them to resign. We'll speak to a representative of families bereaved by COVID. And we'll ask our political experts, what now?
And I'm here in the Chancellor's North Yorkshire constituency to see how today's developments have gone down and what people think should happen next.
Good evening. Boris Johnson broke the COVID lockdown rules on June the 19th, 2020, and therefore has been found to have broken the law, and there could be more to come. We understand that at least 2 more gatherings attended by the Prime Minister are being investigated. But does the Prime Minister think it really matters? This is the man who time and again addressed the nation, warning us that the lockdown laws were essential for our safety. Despite apologising today for breaking those same rules himself, Mr Johnson appears determined to remain in number 10. And tonight, after many hours of silence, Chancellor Rishi Sunak issued his own statement of apology and made it clear he plans to stay in number 11. Well, earlier, in Boris Johnson's only tweet today, he signalled the defence of his prime ministership, referring to a conversation with President Biden. Our joint focus remains on supporting President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people in their fight for freedom. But in the court of public opinion, is that good enough a defence? Here's our policy editor Lewis Goodall at the Newsnight wall.
Yes, Kirsty, this is what we were told, what you at home were told, time and time again.
Have you lied to the public, Prime Minister?
Was there a Christmas party or wasn't there?
I'm not aware of the Christmas party.
Was there a party?
No rules were broken.
I don't even know if an event took place, but if it did, that no rules were broken.
Is it your position that that was not a party?
What I can tell you is that all the guidelines were observed.
He was, in a sense, ambushed with a cake.
Were you at the party, sir?
Well, we now know that all of that was nonsense. The rules weren't followed. Police have issued over 50 fines across Downing Street and the Cabinet Office for breaking the law in the heart of the pandemic, at the heart of government. We now know that among those with fines, reported to have been issued with fines, include Kate Josephs, the former Director General of the COVID-19 Task Force, Helen McNamara, the former head of the government's Propriety and Ethics Unit, the Prime Minister's own wife, Carrie Johnson, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, and indeed, now we know, the Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson. Now, the party the Prime Minister has received a fine for is June the 19th, 2020, the famous reported birthday cake incident. There are other events being investigated by the police as well, so there could yet be more fines to come. But the important point is this, that it makes the Prime Minister the first Prime Minister in British history to break the law and receive a criminal sanction. Here is how to think about it legally.
A fixed penalty notice can be given out when a police officer reasonably believes that an offence has been committed under the coronavirus regulations. It doesn't create a criminal record. It doesn't make you a criminal offender because you've not been convicted of any criminal offence. It's more, the best way to think about it is a criminal sanction short of being convicted of a crime.
Some people say, well, it's just like a parking fine. Well, it is indeed the same mechanism, a fixed penalty notice. But take a look at the Crown Prosecution Service's own guidance for those offences at the time. And this is what it says. Given that the offences in the regulations are related to measures imposed to prevent the spread of infection throughout the UK, they should be considered serious. A prosecution will therefore likely be required in a majority of cases. Another way of thinking about it is that it seems unlikely that any minister would have said that it's like a parking fine at the time. Now, aside from that, there are several important principles at play here. First, as basic as ministers obeying the law. The ministerial code, the Prime Minister's own code, says this: there is an overarching duty on ministers to comply with the law and protect the integrity of public life. Well, how can that code stand and mean anything in these circumstances? What precedent does it set for the future that the Prime Minister and Chancellor did not uphold it and yet have stayed in office? Then there's the principle and convention of misleading Parliament. That's also in the ministerial code, that ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament must resign. So what do we make of this?
Been repeatedly assured that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken.
The only conclusions really can be that either the Prime Minister knowingly misled the House, a cardinal offence under our Constitution for which he'd be expected to resign, or that he didn't completely understand his own rules, his own laws that he imposed on the rest of us, and so unknowingly misled Parliament. That was effectively the defence, indeed, that the Prime Minister offered today.
On a day that happened to be my birthday, there was a brief gathering in the Cabinet Room shortly after 2 p.m, lasting for less than 10 minutes, during which people I work with kindly passed on their good wishes. And I have to say, in all frankness, at that time, it did not occur to me that this might have been a breach of the rules. But of course, the police have found otherwise, and I fully respect the outcome of their investigation.
But the rules were clear at the time. Indoor meetings of more than 2 people on the 18th of June 2020 were banned, unless reasonably necessary for work. Here's another important principle. What happens if the government had to make rules like this again? Could ministers do so credibly after all of this? And what of the politics? Well, as things stand, it doesn't feel like Tory MPs are about to write the requisite 54 letters to Sir Graham Brady to trigger a leadership contest. The Ukraine war has transformed the political terrain, provided an insulating political layer for Boris Johnson, despite the fact, of course, that there are plenty of precedents for changing a leader when Britain was actually at war itself, whether that was Churchill in 1945, Chamberlain in 1940, or Asquith in 1916. Boris Johnson, as ever, is a lucky politician. Lucky that this didn't come before the war, but his luck will need to hold. There may be more fines. The full Sue Gray report is still to come. Local elections, which could be difficult for the Prime Minister, and a probable by-election too. And no amount of luck will change history, now set in stone, that Boris Johnson will always be the first Prime Minister to receive a criminal sanction to break the law in office, an asterisk, a mark forever, next to his name.
Thanks, Lewis Goodall. Well, now joining me is Jackie Green. She's a spokesperson for the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. Her mother, Beryl, passed away in December 2020 after contracting COVID in hospital. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, what do you make of what happened today?
I think it's positive, actually. I think it's really important that these fines have been issued. And it's basically saying that, yes, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor did break the law, and I think that's hugely important because really they've been evading questions and lying for so long about this. It feels a very positive step to get this result.
But you've been in touch with a lot of the bereaved families, and I wonder what their response has been.
Obviously very sad that it's come to this. Because really, you know, we should expect far more from our leader of this country. But I think we all feel the same, that this is a good thing to happen and really should be the start, not the end.
I mean, obviously, I'm sure you do think about this a lot, but looking back at what you were going through the time of that first party, what was actually happening?
I hadn't seen Mum for 10 months because we'd been in lockdown for most of that time. I spoke to her on the phone daily, but clearly that's not enough. She was a widow, she lived on her own, and she was very lonely.
Do you think the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor should have resigned today?
Absolutely, 100%, yes. There's no integrity, they're dishonest, and really, particularly Boris Johnson, should do the right thing now and step down.
Jackie Green, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP for North West Cambridgeshire, Shailesh Vara, and by the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve, who's currently on a walking trip to Spain. He was a Tory MP for 2 decades before being thrown out of the party for defying Boris Johnson on Brexit. Shailesh Vara, first of all, if I could just come to you on this. You're a lawyer, you resigned for government on a point of principle, and you're a principled man. Don't you feel uneasy and compromised to support a man who's broken the law and thinks he can stay on?
Well, good evening, Kirsty, and good evening to all your viewers. I think it's important to consider matters in the broad perspective here. Certainly, the Prime Minister has been found guilty. He has admitted it, he has apologised, he's accepted full responsibility, and he's paid the fine. But I think the broader context here is that we've been living in extraordinary circumstances for the past 2 years.
Yes, but you heard Jackie Green saying there, her mother was alone for 8 months. You know, politicians, MPs were hearing about this in their surgeries every day of the week. So it goes back to the idea that it's one rule for one rule for the other. Surely, as a lawyer, you cannot see that that is in any way a reasonable way to behave.
Well, first of all, can I just express my sympathies to the lady who just spoke on a personal level, and also from the huge number of constituents who wrote to me. I fully understand and sympathise with her position, and indeed the position of thousands, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people across the country. But what I do think is important is that in these extraordinary times, times that none of us have ever experienced in our lifetime before, the person at the top of the government here is somebody who has taken the right calls on extraordinarily difficult decisions. On the vaccine rollout, it was one of the best in the world, which has positively impacted on and benefited the people of the United Kingdom. Over £400 billion, he authorised the payment of that to individuals and businesses, which as a direct consequence of that, the UK economy is in a far better position than most other countries across the world. And on Ukraine, don't take my word for it because I'm a Tory. Take the word of President Zelensky and of Vladimir Putin. Zelensky has said that Boris Johnson has led the way and is leading the other global leaders. Putin says that he is Russia's #1 public enemy. We are at a critical and very dangerous stage in position as far as Europe is concerned, the most dangerous since the Second World War. And Boris Johnson is leading the attack, supporting Ukraine against Russia's aggression. And I think we need to remember that that is leadership. And he...
Yes, that may be leadership. That may be leadership, Shailesh Vara, but just sorry to interrupt you on that. You heard that from Lewis Goodall there. You know, we changed prime ministers in the middle of the Second World War and won the war. Nobody is entirely indispensable. And it does sound as if, you know, people in your position are in a way shoring up what you believe in order to get through this. And I wonder what you would feel if there are 2 more investigations and Boris Johnson is found to have broken the rules, the law, yet again, not necessarily just once, but twice. If there were 2 more transgressions, would you still feel the same way?
Well, I'm not making any comments on speculation as to what will or won't be decided by the police on the number of inquiries they're making over a huge number of people. What I will say, however, is that I fully appreciate, as does the Prime Minister, the importance of what has happened. And he has said that if, you know, he's apologized, he's taken full responsibility, and he has made substantial changes. In fact, he took on board all the recommendations made by Sue Gray to make sure that Number 10 is a better place to work for in terms of being bound by the law, because Number 10 and the Prime Minister are all bound by the law. Nobody's above the law. But what I come back to is this, that in these extraordinary times, this Prime Minister has led the way and made the right call on a number of very important and critical decisions. And I do not think that we should be talking about getting rid of him, when instead we should be ensuring and supporting him at this critical time as the UK recovers from COVID and as we collectively in Europe face the aggression of Russia, and it is Boris Johnson who is leading the other global leaders there. And that is something that, as I said earlier on, it's not something that that you should take from me as a Tory, but take from the people who are in the critical positions of President Zelensky, and indeed Putin rates us as #1 public enemy, or Boris Johnson.
So in that case, would he still have your support if there was no war?
Boris Johnson, yes. Because he would. I mean, this is the latest. So now this is the latest situation where he is making the right call. But there have been many, many other decisions, and I've referred to some of them, Kirsty. So the vaccine rollout, one of the best, if not the best. So very briefly, just to finish, because we just to finish with you, we all remember that picture of the Queen sitting alone at Prince Philip's funeral. What do you think Boris Johnson should say at the next audience with Her Majesty? I think the Prime Minister has already apologised to her. And of course, the Prime Minister has admitted that he's made mistakes. He's apologised. He's paid the fine. But as I said earlier on, we should look at this in a broader context of a huge number of decisions requiring difficult decisions to be made. And he's made the right call on them. But of course, my sympathies, as well as the Prime Minister's, and he said this, go out to the many, many people who have suffered in so many ways, and the suffering and the grief is something that should not in any way be diminished.
Thank you very much indeed. If I can turn to you now, Dominic Grieve, thanks very much for joining us tonight. So you can hear there very clearly that not all Conservatives agree one way or the other. There is no big groundswell now. We know that. There aren't the letters for Boris Johnson's resignation.
It's woeful. Listening to Shailesh, I'm afraid it's one of the most woeful things I've heard. This is the Prime Minister. This is a person who's in a position of great authority, was given powers to enact by decree, effectively, legislation limiting people's rights, and then breaches those rules himself. If he were a High Court judge and he weren't to resign having done this, I'm sure Shailesh would be very properly about to vote in Parliament to remove that person from office. And yet, because it's the Prime Minister, and because of a whole gobbledygook of explanations as to his indispensability, he's to be supported. He's plainly not indispensable. I happen to completely support the government's policy on the Ukraine, but there's other people within the Conservative Party who can be found to become Prime Minister. What the Conservative Party is doing, if it follows Shailesh's view, will be to keep in office somebody who has been shown to be a proven liar in Parliament and to have broken the law. And I think the reputational damage it does to democracy is profound. The reputational damage it's going to do to the Conservative Party will be immense. And it's part of a process by which I'm afraid the Conservative Party has been subtly corrupted by Mr. Johnson, because it's not the first time obviously, Dominic, that he has behaved in ways which are questionable.
Sorry, just to interrupt, just to say there, we must be absolutely clear about this. You have long had no truck with Boris Johnson, and in fact, you were thrown out the party. And I wonder if you would accept that a lot of Conservatives do look at what Boris Johnson has done in Ukraine, and what Shailesh Farah was saying there. There's no doubt that Putin actually rates him as it were the #1 target for effective opposition to what's happening in the invasion of Ukraine.
As I know from my time as chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, Putin rates the United Kingdom as its #1 opponent in terms of its activities in Europe. And that's for good reason, because we have been pretty consistent in standing up to him. As I say, I have no criticism of Boris Johnson's approach to the Ukraine, but that doesn't make him indispensable. And the argument that he is indispensable when he has behaved in such an outrageous fashion in breach of his own ministerial code is about producing a series of excuses, because that's what Shailesh has just done, which my judgment, are unjustified and will do lasting damage to our democratic institutions. Either people are prepared to stand up for the principles and ethics they believe in, or they're prepared, at Mr. Johnson's nod and wink, to just park them. And that has nothing to do with political disagreements. There are plenty of colleagues I had in the Conservative Party with whom I've disagreed over the years, who I regard as being individuals of complete integrity. But this is a process by which, in fact, the way the state operates in its institutions is being corroded.
Thank you very much.
If
And
this
Dominic
is
Green,
tolerated, it will cause lasting damage.
Dominic Green, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Well, we'll be speaking to leading figures from Labour and the SNP opposition parties in a few moments. First, though, this has already been a torrid time for Rishi Sunak, mired in revelations about his wife's financial affairs. He referred himself to the Prime Minister's ethics advisor over claims he'd not been transparent about his tax arrangements. She, a non-dom, is now to pay tax on overseas income. Now the man who holds the second highest office in the land has been found to have broken the law, but like his boss, is staying put. So how is the news of the Chancellor's law-breaking going down in his constituency of Richmond in North Yorkshire? Our reporter Anna Collinson joins us from the town. Anna.
Yeah, good evening. This has been Rishi Sunak's constituency home for nearly 7 years now. Just a short way over to Northallerton is where his constituency offices are, and about a 30-minute drive from here is his constituency home, a mansion said to be worth millions. And we've spent this afternoon and this evening, granted not in the rain, talking to lots of people who live in the town of Richmond to see how they feel that not only their MP but also the Prime Minister have been fined for attending parties during lockdown. Now, some people say they're furious, others say they're angry, or they were angry, but they now feel so drained by it. They have bigger things to worry about, like paying their bills or the events that are going on in Ukraine. I think it's fair to say most people we spoke to were more angry with Boris Johnson than they were with Rishi Sunak. But of course, we are in Rishi Sunak's constituency. And I did speak to one man who didn't want to come on camera, but he is a fan of Rishi Sunak. He said he believes he's done really well during the pandemic. He cited the furlough as a great example of that. And he says most people, or many people, broke the rules during lockdown. So Rishi Sunak should just pay his fine so we can all move on. Now, shortly after we spoke to people here, Rishi Sunak released an apology. The big question is, after what we've heard today, will that be enough? It's been a day of explosive news at Westminster. Unprecedented police fines, followed by full and unreserved apologies. In Richmond, North Yorkshire, the atmosphere appears calm. But for some, the mood is far from content.
We were all stuck in the house, like we couldn't even go see my grandparents or anything, and then they were just all partying.
How did that make you feel?
Angry, really angry. 'Cause I didn't see my granddad for probably over a year. So yeah, I think it's disgusting, to be honest.
They just weren't thinking properly, which again is alarming. It's just so alarming.
Richmond's MP and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, has spent the past few days defending his wife's tax status.
I do feel sorry for Rishi. I think he's had a really difficult week, and some of what's been said isn't necessarily right, I think.
Now Rishi Sunak has been dealt a further blow after it was revealed he and Prime Minister Boris Johnson would be fined by the Met Police over lockdown parties in Downing Street. Rishi Sunak is your MP.
Yes, he is.
Would an apology be enough in your eyes from him? Is that what you want?
What else could he do?
Well, Labour are calling for him to resign.
I don't think I'd go as far as that. But it would have to be a very, very grovelling apology.
But is an unreserved apology enough?
People have been under a lot of pressure. Whether it's been from small things to the very, very big, like losing someone you love who you never get to speak to again. Absolutely horrendous. To have parties under those conditions. Apart from anything else, frankly, they're in a very important job. Should they really be, having suitcases of wine brought into Downing Street? Should they not have been going tucked up in bed, ready for the next day? Who knows? Would I have done it? I don't think so. And I would resign if I'd been in that position, but that's me.
Of course, the timings of these fines is important. think that anger's kind of died down a bit because of what's going on in Ukraine? What would you say?
I don't know. I feel like people are still angry, but they're just not getting their voice out because of what's happening in Ukraine. It's like COVID. COVID's not in the news as much now because of Ukraine. It just seems a bit convenient.
The anger appears to be felt across the generations, but for some, there's a sense of apathy, whether an apology is unreserved or not.
It doesn't really make a difference to me, to be honest, but I mean, they can try, but people are still going to be angry at the end of the day, aren't they? People have lost nearly 2 years of their life, and they were like partying on. So,
what will be your message to them this evening?
Get your act together and apologise to the people. Because I think it's what we deserve, to be honest.
Anna Collins. Well, let's speak now to Labour Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and the leader of the Scottish National Party in Westminster, Ian Blackford. Yvette Cooper, first of all, isn't it a failure of opposition that there is absolutely no way that you can remove a law-breaking Prime Minister and Chancellor if you want to?
The Prime Minister has a majority in Parliament and we have a parliamentary system, but I think there is a huge obligation on him and on the Chancellor to recognise their responsibilities, to uphold standards of integrity, to recognise the fact that they broke the law and it was a law that they'd written, a law that they asked people across the country to make huge sacrifices to abide by. They instructed people to abide by those laws, and people did miss out on seeing dying relatives. Kids missed out on birthday parties. People missed out on going to the funerals of friends because of those laws. And for the Prime Minister and Chancellor to just effectively shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, they broke them, but actually it doesn't really matter. They can just carry on as normal, is disrespecting the huge sacrifices that people made, dishonouring people across the country.
But do you accept that, again, after the pandemic, we are in exceptional times in our involvement in the war in Ukraine, and that does demand stability?
So I think we're united on Ukraine. I think whoever the Prime Minister was, our policy on Ukraine would remain the same. We're a united cross-party in support for Ukraine and in opposition to Putin's illegal war. And bear in mind that we have changed Prime Ministers, not just in the First and Second World Wars, but also during the First Gulf War as well. So we have a parliamentary system that allows for that. But in the end, they disrespected huge sacrifices that people had made. The Queen recognised the importance of showing leadership and showing respect for the country. The Prime Minister didn't, and that is deeply shameful and deeply damaging.
But aren't there ways that, with rhetoric or whatever, you could cut through? But in fact, we don't see Keir Starmer cutting through in this. He has made several speeches. He's talked about it, but there is no cut through. You know, right now there is no sign that it's cutting through.
I think what Keir Starmer said today, and it's something that he said previously in Parliament, actually is very powerful and has cut through, which is that people have felt really guilty that they did abide by the law because they missed out on being there to hold their mum's hand when she was dying or to be there for a bereaved relative, and feel guilty about that. And actually, they shouldn't feel guilty because they were respecting the law in order to save people's lives. The people who should feel guilty are the people who've now been found to have broken the law, not just the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, but the other 50 fines already that we know have been issued because there was a culture of ignoring those laws, that sense of there being one rule for them and another for everyone else.
Yvette Cooper, thank you very much. Yvette Cooper, thank you very much. Ian Blackford, if I can turn to you. You want Parliament recalled. What good will a recall of Parliament do except to air grievance?
It's not about airing grievance, Kirsty. What should be happening is the Prime Minister should be on the phone to the Speaker, recalling Parliament for Thursday, so that he and Sunak can hand in their resignation. You know, this is a really important moment for all of us because you've got a Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister in history that's broken the law, a Prime Minister that has lied to Parliament, lied to the public on numerous occasions. And we all know that willfully misleading Parliament is a resignation matter in itself. There has to be standards in public life. There has to be integrity. And this Prime Minister, this Chancellor, have lost the moral authority to lead.
Well, I wonder what you make of the Met's position. Do you think the Met is to blame for releasing this during recess?
No, I think they might have a job to do and they bring that information out in a timely manner. The point is that the Prime Minister has to be accountable. The Prime Minister should be accepting his own responsibility. He simply should not be remaining in office. And I would ask Conservative MPs tonight to listen to the words of my old colleague from the Intelligence and Security Committee, Dominic Grieve, because it doesn't go too far to say that our democracy is at stake from a Prime Minister that thinks he can willfully break the law, willfully lie, and there are no consequences. That's not good enough. And it's a pattern of behaviour that the Prime Minister seems to think that laws are for the rest of us and he can do as he pleases.
Well, let me just put one question to you in Blackpool. We've talked a bit about Ukraine, but can you deny that the Prime Minister has actually led from the front on Ukraine and has been a powerful force in the, as it were, coalition against Vladimir Putin?
I'll tell you who has led from the front over Ukraine. It's been the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and he's made sure that we've worked together, those of us in the SNP, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, on a cross-party basis, making sure that we get equipment in to support the Ukrainians. But if we're looking at the Prime Minister's record on Ukraine, his treatment of refugees has been woeful. We're way behind the curve in terms of getting people out of Ukraine that need our sanctuary. So no, I don't believe that it's a scorecard for the Prime Minister has done well. But let's not forget that the Western world is united against what are crimes of aggression, war crimes from Putin. We have changed Prime Minister in previous periods of war. This man has no moral authority to lead. He weakens our ability to be a force for good. And Conservative MPs need to have a backbone. They need to understand that they are now in the dock as to whether or not they are prepared to leave an office.
Thank you very much, Ian Blackford. I'm afraid we have to stop you there. Thank you very much indeed. Well, politicians like to say that opinion polls don't much matter, but of course they follow them closely. The vaccine rollout did give the Prime Minister a bounce, but when the Partygate scandal hit, Boris Johnson's personal ratings were knocked for 6. At the height of Partygate at the turn of the year, 3/4 of people in the UK considered the Prime Minister to be untrustworthy, according to YouGov. And there was an appetite for his resignation. 62% of people in January this year thought he should go. Today, the question of trust still looms large. And according to Comres, 7 out of 10 people say that Johnson knowingly misled Parliament. Compared to January, however, in the latest polls, slightly fewer people want the Prime Minister to resign. 61% according to Comres, 57% for YouGov. Either way, still a substantial majority. Despite that, only 1 in 10 believes he will actually leave his post. As for the Chancellor, he scored similarly to the Prime Minister, ranging from 57% to 59% in favour of resignation, but his standing is 2% poorer than Boris Johnson's. 50% of 2019 Conservative voters now think the worse of Rishi Sunak. So what impact does this episode have on the Prime Minister's authority and, by extension, the state of our democracy? Joining me now in the studio is former advisor to Boris Johnson, Tim Montgomery, and Telegraph journalist Christopher Hope, and via Zoom, Emily Sheffield from the Evening Standard. Thank you all very much for joining us. First of all, Tim Montgomery, you worked with Boris Johnson at Number 10. You quit. Has anything about what happened today and the way this turned out surprised you?
Unfortunately not. And I don't want to make predictions in politics at all at the moment, Kirsty, about when certain things will happen. But I think some of those opinion poll numbers that you just read out, and 75% of the British people think that the Prime Minister lied about this issue. Only 12% think he told the truth. That is unsustainable. And at some point, because of those sort of numbers, the Prime Minister will have to go. Because when he stands up at any future time and promises tax cuts or to spend more on defence or whatever it is, there is now a decisive number of voters who simply don't believe a word that the Prime Minister says. And that is fatal sooner rather than later.
Emily Sheffield, I mean, the polling is pretty clear that the public don't like this. But in the end, with a majority of over 80, what they don't like really doesn't matter. That's what it seems to look like.
I think the crisis could come in, the crisis for Boris Johnson's leadership could come in 2 moments. And the first one could be that there could be more fines. He could get up to 6, I believe. I worry then that the party may think his position is untenable. He is, after all, the first Prime Minister who committed a criminal offence. in office. Of course, we'll then have the rest of the Sue Gray report coming out soon after, which is going to be another hefty blow. And on top of this, you're going to have the local elections coming in May. I think we've got some very, very tricky weeks ahead. I think the bigger problem for Boris Johnson is going to be coming up to the next election and the next general election is that the cost of living crisis is probably still going to be very much with us. We don't know where the Ukraine war is going to be, and that's definitely given him a bump. We could still be muddied in that, and he may not be looking so much the hero anymore. And of course, those red wall supporters, which you just mentioned, if levelling up has not delivered and they're feeling a lot poorer and they think their Prime Minister has lied endlessly to Parliament, I don't think that's going to be looking very good for him.
Well, let's turn around briefly, Christopher, to what we think about Rishi Sunak, because the Times is running the story that Rishi Sunak was actually going to resign, had written a resignation letter. What have you heard?
Well, it's not a surprise, given that we were asking his advisors what's going on, is Rishi resigning? No response back for about 2 hours tonight. It looked very strange that there was no attempt to say sorry, to admit he'd broken the law and then say sorry, to do something to retrieve the situation. So that's believable. I don't know if it's true, though.
What do you think his calculations are?
Well, it looks like I think he'll be moved anyway in the July reshuffle, because you can't have the guy who raised the national insurance level that was a manifesto breach debating tax policy with Rachel Reeves' next election. So why not go now and go with a reason? That would have exploded a huge bomb under Boris Johnson's premiership. And
I wonder what you're hearing. Is the party uneasy tonight? What are you actually hearing?
Well, as we've been on air, we are seeing more MPs offer support for Boris Johnson, but the problem he's got is this could be the beginning of a series of fines. And I think that, you know, you don't want to get burned too early by backing him now and have to back down in the future. There might be some future parties which are much more serious than this one.
Well, you were saying earlier that the things are future ominous things in the future, Tim Montgomery, but two definite more investigations involving Boris Johnson. If they come out in quick succession, Parliament is back from recess next week, and if Boris Johnson is found to have broken the law not just once but twice more, might that change the equation?
I think it could, and I think people have said that this horrific war in Ukraine has been lucky, in inverted commas, for Boris Johnson just at the moment. But the way the Met Police are handling this investigation doesn't seem that lucky for me. If it is coming out in drips and drabs, and it looks like there's a sustained case against him, that is very difficult. And I think what we don't really have yet, and this is why I think the Gray report may still be the real bombshell under his premiership, is that will give us the detail of the nature of what went on in these parties, because it was the details like, the smuggling in of a suitcase full of alcohol for the party that was held before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. Yeah. That's what really shook a lot of people. If we start getting details of that kind, and I should stress about the parties for which the Prime Minister's been fined, then it suddenly moves from sort of something that's academic to something that people can all really understand and get angry about again. And that, I think, is the danger for the Prime Minister.
Emily Sheffield, is a sense that we should all be asking, is this how democracy actually works? Because how can we call ourselves a law-abiding country when the people who lead the country don't abide by the law?
I completely agree, but our democracy is also about voting people in and out. And the general public will have the opportunity to vote on the Prime Minister, both in the forthcoming May elections and in the general election. I do think it's going to be incredibly hard if he does get fined more. And we've got to remember that, 30 fines were handed out today? Well, that makes
80
Downing Street... Oh, sorry, 80 in all. I do apologise.
Well, 80 in total have been handed out. 80
in total. Well, if that's one very small street, that must be the biggest crime hotspot in Britain tonight. It doesn't look good. And how can you keep trying to lead a country when you're sitting in a street that's broken the law 80 times?
He's not going to go anywhere. The problem is, it's the Tory MPs who have his future in their hands. He is a good campaigner. It's not clear who can follow him. I can't see any real serious contender. I never really thought Rishi Sunak was a serious contender, because I'm not sure he's very political, and certainly he's shown that in the past week. I just don't see how where the pressure comes.
The pressure will come, particularly if the Liberal Democrats do well in the local elections. That's what will really put the fear of God into Tories. If the average Conservative MP in southern parts of Britain feels that the Liberal Democrats can make the kind of breakthrough they did in Patton's former seat, in Cheryl Gillen's former seat, in Cheshire and Hampshire, that will frighten the Tories. And suddenly, I have a lot of sympathy with what Chris has just said, but if the Tories are frightened, they will find a leader to replace Boris Johnson.
What I was going to say,
no doubt about
what
it.
Dominic Greaves said, you heard Dominic Greaves say, actually, the idea of indefensibility, well, you know what I mean, is it ridiculous that nobody's indispensable? He says, of course he's dispensable. But actually, there's two things there. He's dispensable in terms of another person could lead us in the war effort. Is dispensable in the sense that another person could give that majority, could provide that majority.
No one's got that X factor that Boris Johnson has in these red wall seats. These fines are bad. They are legacy issues. Before he sorted out Number 10 Downing Street, the way it's been run with new people involved there, David Canzini, serious people the Tories know very well. The grown-ups are back in charge of Number 10. I think he can present that when he gets back to Parliament next week.
Well, let me just ask a very quick fire round to you. First of all, Tim, will Boris Johnson be the Conservative Party candidate at the next election?
Don't think so, and certainly hope not.
Christopher?
Yes.
And will he win?
Yes.
Emily Sheffield, will he be the candidate at the next election?
Very possibly.
And if he
Very
is, will he win?
Very possibly.
Thank you all very much indeed.
You heard it here first.
We've got quick the Mirror tomorrow, led by liars and lawbreakers on the Mirror. The Guardian, PM, I broke my own law, but I refuse to go. Daily Mail, don't they know there's a war on? And The Sun goes with, I'm sorry, but I have work to do. That's all we have time for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.